Alrighty, everyone. I'm gonna pop the order that kind of Ollie and I have sussed out right before the whiskies that we're going to taste today, but might crack onto it. I think we've got quite a few people here already. But yeah, welcome to the Top Shelf Tassie tasting. Very, very exciting. We're going to be taking you through some of this history of Aussie whiskey, this journey of Aussie whiskey, specifically Tasmania, because they started it all. They're Ireland, I suppose, you could say. But yeah, I recommend pouring them all out into tasting glasses. This is one of those ones where quite a few are cask strength, and some of them can do with opening up. Blanket reminder, please don't drive. No, I don't have to say this. We're all sitting comfortably at home in front of our computers, but it's always good to remember. And yeah, it's pretty intimate tonight. So if you wanted to ask a question and just pop through asking to unmute yourself, and you can obviously ask a question, and we'll discuss throughout the tastings. I would love seeing your tasting notes in the chat as well. And if you have any questions and you don't want to unmute, just pop them through in the chat and we'll get to them as well. But I think, shall we get a crack onto it, Ollie, and jump right into the whiskey, the drams?
Just maybe give it 30 more seconds. I've kicked an email off to everyone reminding we're kicking off, so there might be a couple of stragglers.
Yep, absolutely.
Random question to everyone. Do you agree with that order before we start? Thumbs up if people are liking that order.
We were at fisticuffs before on which order we wanted for it. Sounds good. No dissenting opinions. Yeah, it is light to dark. I'm hoping, because some of them are higher ABV as well, hopefully Australia being known for its big bold sherry cask, it won't mess too much with that.
It's always interesting. Do you go ABV from lowest to highest, light to dark? Some whiskies we just know because of their age, their and maybe what they've been matured in, they potentially could, be awesome further down the line, but we need to maybe put them up earlier because some of the other whiskies are just all sugar from maybe a tawny cask or something. Or we in our last virtual tasting we had a Lafroig whiskey number 4 out of 6, and people were like, you don't have that peated whiskies afterwards, and it was a 31 Lafroig, so there's very little peat in it, so putting it to the end would just give it a disservice. So yeah, it's hard picking the order sometimes, especially we don't doing a vertical for one distillery, and the distiller who knows their product inside out can advise us. We're running a bit blind, so hopefully yeah, you agree with our order. If not, we'll hear your feedback, no doubt.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's go.
Absolutely. And yes, as Tom said, of course, you had to start with the Sullivans Cove. So obviously, probably Australia's most famous distillery, after taking out world's best single malt in 2014 and then again in 2018. Now, I don't know the exact cask number on this bottling, Ollie, that would be, I think, your domain. But yeah, starting off strong with a Sullivan's Cove. So they won back in 2014 for their French oak cask, and then 2014 for the French oak. 2018 was the American oak, so that's what we're drinking today. So it's all refill American oak barrels. They are actually at the point now at the distillery where they're starting to reuse and have those second fill barrels that they've already produced from, which is pretty exciting. But it's a distillery that we all know, but we don't know that, we don't think about the history of it that much as we do, say, somewhere like Lark Distillery. And Sullivan's Cove actually had, quite a few ups and downs with 4 different sales in its early life. They tried distilling in 1996, and sold the company, and then again in 1999 they tried distilling, sold the company. And then finally, 2003, a gentleman named Patrick Mcguire, who was kind of an unsung hero of the Australian whiskey industry. He picked it up with a couple of small investor friends of his, and he started the ball rolling to become, to make Sullivan's Cove what it is today. So he was at the helm, he was the distiller for them. And he was actually, up until very recently, he's left to start his own venture. I think Ollie and I got to meet him at the Australian Distillers Gala and quiz him a little bit about it, but he's very cagey about what he's doing next. But he wants to create, kind of the new Johnny Walker, or kind of Glenfiddich vibe for Australian whiskey. So that should be something exciting to take a look into. But yeah, the distillery is in a small little industrial area in Cambridge, Hobart. And they originally started using wash from new brew, and they started a trend with using locally produced wash, and they switched to Cascade, and now every new distillery in Hobart says, oh, I want the same wash that Sullivans have whenever they go to Cascade to get their wash. So it's a very, very influential distillery, without a doubt. And yeah, it's one of the best whiskies in the world. So it's hard to kind of find anything in it that really doesn't showcase true quality Australian distilling. So yeah, so we start off strong. What does everyone think? Tasting notes and everything.
While you're waiting for the tasting notes, so I've got the bottle information. I've lost the bottle somewhere in the pile of whiskey behind me. It's a Sullivan's Cove American Oak second fill, cask TD 0084. It's 15 years old, 48%, which is their signature, and only produced 403 bottles. For those who fly into Hobart, Cambridge is the first suburb pretty much out the airport. So both Spring Bay Distillery and Sullivan's Cove are in that suburb. So it's a wonderful way to start a Tassie tour of whiskey. Some people like to fly into Launceston, drive down to Hobart, or fly into Hobart and go north. But yeah, it's usually the beginning or the end of most people's tours. So they obviously are known for their online ballots. But then if you go to the cellar door, they promise to always have one rotating cask until it's sold out. It's sold out, but it's always a different whiskey that you can't buy online at the cellar door. And that's just something that the team have been doing. So we were down in Tassie end of April, beginning of May.
End of April.
Yes. Yeah, it was the 30th. But yeah, we got there and they said, yeah, this is freshly batched. We got one of the first few bottles, got to try it, and not Sully's isn't, cheap. It's a decently priced whiskey, but yeah, highly recommend go do the tour, go try some of their whiskeys, and then it's just picking up something as a cellar door cask that you just can't buy online. And once 400 bottles are gone, that's it, and it's a bit of history. And yeah, 15 years old. What do people think?
Other than the apricot and almond tart is such a good tasting note. I always get this feeling of walking through a field, like a wheat field, whenever I drink Sullivan's Cove. It's just a very English summer feeling. I don't quite know how to describe it.
It is quite,
yeah.
I was going to say it is quite grassy, but like a wet meadow.
Yeah.
Morning dew. That's a better tasting note.
And I will say as well, if anyone's going down to Hobart and going to Sullivan's, I believe Hobart Whiskey Distillery or Devil's Distillery is a suburb over and kind of nearby. But very, very dear friend, an old co-worker of mine, Miranda from Whiskey and Ailment, is now based at Sullivan's Cove, and they have such an incredible team of people. If you ever have the pleasure to meet their current distiller, Heather, she is an icon. She's supremely talented and super geeky about all things whiskey and wine, actually. So definitely people to pick their brains and have a wonderful time. I can't wait to go down and see them again.
Oh, the whole team. Ali, they're such a wonderful cellar door team. They have just announced a new site as well, which is exciting. So going to be back in Sullivan's Cove.
Going to be very cool. I feel like they've done the opposite from Spring Bay, who expanded from Spring Bay into Cambridge, and Sully's is going from Cambridge back to Spring Bay, Sullivan's Cove. But yeah.
Howard and everyone else who just joined, that's the order, starting with Sullivans.
Ooh, Ione with a good question. You know, what do you think it is that makes Tassie whiskey so special? I think a small part of it is the part that they were the first to jump on the bandwagon. You know, the industry really couldn't have taken off without Bill Larkin, without the Tasmanian climate influencing him and inspiring him. So I think it's sort of like we were here first kind of thing, which they've all taken and run with, and fair cop to them, they make incredible whiskey. So I think that it is kind of that mentality of, well, they've been doing it for longer, you know, they were the first to really start doing it. They have, you know, an incredible climate for it, more similar to Scottish climates, though not supremely similar, but they have lots of, you know, incredible produce as well. Like if you've ever been to the markets in Hobart, they're just the produce that being produced there is incredible. And yeah, the water quality is amazing. Obviously I'm from Melbourne, so I'm very biased about water. But yeah, Tasmanian water for distilling is incredible. But yeah, I think that they're a very crafty state as well. Like they are very small production, small produce. Everybody knows everybody. And you know, when they set out to make something, they want to make it as best quality as they can. And I think consumers and I think people around the world have seen that. So that's why people, you know, get on top of believing that Tassie whiskey is special. So
I've got 2 points to add to that.
Yeah.
Ione, love the question. And I've had this conversation with Bill Lark, with Patrick Mcguire, with Casey Overeem, and they all bring up both of these points in different forms. Bill calls it the rising tide. You know, lifts all boats, all ships. The way I interpret that is, it's such a small island. There's a concentration of distilleries, and when you get into the industry, you kind of know everyone. You get to speak to everyone. So yes, you know, Helios Road, Lark, Sullivan's Cove, and Overeem were the first four, but ex-Overeem distiller Rob has just launched his own distillery, Wabbs Harbour, with two mates on the northeast coast of Tasmania. They're people in the industry, whether they work for one distillery, they go start their own, they jump from distillery to distillery. There's that knowledge sharing, and because it's in such a concentration, I think they go through like the period of cycle they're learning. The iteration loop happens a lot quicker than other parts in the world, similar to what happens in Isla. And I think that's the other point, is it's a tiny island and it's that community. And I know the Scots don't, like, you know, years and years ago they didn't talk to each other, but today now there's lots of knowledge sharing and learning. But yeah, you've got, you know, minimal number of coopers available, so you have to cross paths when you buy barrels. At the very least, if you're getting your barley, you know, there's minimal suppliers, so there's touch points. There's obviously Tasmanian Whiskey Week on the consumer side. There's lots of ways that they get connected. Currently, they've also got the Tassie Whiskey Association, Spirits Association, which similar to the Scotch Whisky Association, they're actually hoping to get a ground set of rules, a foundation of what is Tasmanian whiskey. One day they have dreams of getting an appellation, however you pronounce it, the French, just as champagne basically, and you know, no one else can bottle, but they're debating things like what happens because of green waste? Can you bottle it on the mainland? Because you're shipping glass from the mainland to Tasmania, filling it and then shipping it back. And that's actually not, it's not cheap, and two, it's a lot of fuel is wasted in logistics. So they haven't released what their framework is now, because actually debating those micro details, because they want to be known not just for good quality whiskey, but also eco-friendly and all this other stuff. And it's a wonderful thing if you ever chat to any of the distillers involved. But that's my long short answer is, I think that combination of being a concentrated group but also just the knowledge sharing means they get through feedback, not just on the consumer side, but did that cask work, or did this work, or what happens if there's a leak or a yeast infection or anything like that. How do you solve some of those things? Plumbing, distillery equipment breaks all the time. Like it's tough doing it if you're in the middle of nowhere in the Aussie bush desert, and you're the only distillers for 1,000 kilometers and you've got no one to talk to. Then you don't get to bounce ideas and those learnings, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree that kind of microcosm of people being so close together and working together. And I mean, you think about mainland distilleries, and you got lime burners is yonks away from other distilleries in Western Australia, even in Victoria. The guys up at Yakindanda, at Backwoods, and guys at Kinglake, they're like 3 hours apart. They're friends, but they're 3 hours apart from each other, and they don't have a whole bunch of close distilleries nearby as well. So that's everyone's close, and they're info sharing, and they're getting to know everyone. But yeah, shall we toddle on to the next whiskey, I think?
I forgot to say, obviously drink it the way you want to. I sometimes like to leave some in the glass and come back, because the first whiskey always is a bit of a palate warmer. So it's nice to try a couple others and then come back and see, especially if that first whiskey has changed a little bit for you. I know some people have already necked theirs, so.
I am glass poor at the moment, so it's little drips for me. But yeah, so second whiskey is the Overeem 12-year-old bourbon cask. So this is obviously very exciting. Age statement Australian whiskies are, not something you readily come by, but Overeem is able to do that. So it's one of my favorite distilleries. They're actually one of the few generational distilleries and distilling families in Tasmania. The first obviously being Christie Booth Lark. But yeah, so Overeem was founded by Casey Overeem after he went on a trip to visit family in Norway. So they were local people distilling, and he was like, this is really cool, this is really interesting. He came back to Tasmania, and he was just like, cool, I want to try this out. And through connections, he met Bill Lark, and obviously Bill was, well underway with his distillery at that time. So when Casey started up, he designed his stills to be very identical to Lark's original stills as well. And in the early days of their production, Lark actually made the wash spirit for them. So obviously, to make wash spirit, you've got to have fermenting tanks, and you've got to have, the wash tuns and all of the other bits and bobs that cost a lot of money for a fledgling new business. So Lark does make their own wash, and Overeem would get them to make specific wash to their specifications, and then bring it in to distill it.
Just to add, Casey once told me that, like, he told Bill the specs, but at one point no one in the Lark team knew, and then when he adjusted it, there was only one person in charge of the wash. That way there was no bias, and no one could share knowledge, because they wanted to be known for different spirits, but whiskey starts as obviously barley and then you wash. So yes, you can kind of compare notes and stuff, but they tried to keep their recipes like Chinese walls essentially, and go, that was one of their big points of difference, and they agreed on it mutually. Both Bill and Casey, they said it was in fairness for each other, but also for the industry, because they didn't want to have two distilleries of the same whiskey at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things where, the base that you start with can really make a huge impact over the whiskey in every stage of the process. which is obviously, like I was saying before, why so many people are clamoring after the exact same recipe from Cascade as Sullivan's Cove has. So yeah, so Casey was very, very, created this specific wash, and he very much had a firm style that he wanted to make his whiskey in. And it didn't take long before the brand really took off. I would probably comfortably say that Overeem is one of the better known brand names of Australian whiskey. And yeah, it took off internationally, it took off in Australia, and kind of outgrew Casey's expectations. And so he decided to retire back in 2013. And he sold the brand on to Hobart Distillery Proprietary Limited, which came under Australian Whisky Holdings later on. And his daughter Jane, who had been brand ambassador for Overeem, stayed on as brand ambassador despite the sale of the business to Lark Distilling. And few things happened with Australian Whisky Holdings, but Jane left before then to start her own distillery with her husband Mark in 2016, Salford Distillery, for S&O single malt whiskey, because she couldn't use the name Overeem, it belonged to Lark. And they designed their distillery exactly after the original Overeem that Casey had made. So there still is pretty much identical. Their wash is identical to what Casey was using. And she really just wanted to make her father's whiskey again. So Jane was cobbling away making whiskey under Salford, and Australian Whisky Holdings had a bit of an implosion business-wise, shall we say, and they had to sell off assets, and one of those assets was the Overeem brand. And obviously the first people they floated selling the asset to was the Overeems, and they absolutely jumped on them. And as of 2020, Overeem brand has been back in the Overeem family, Overeem Salford family, can't forget Mark. But yeah, so all of the whiskey being produced under Salford Distillery will now become Overeem whiskey again. And I've had the very pleasure to taste the first barrel that they laid down, and I can tell you I am so excited for when it comes out. But this is some of the older Overeem stock. So this is whiskey that was laid down probably while, Casey was still there, and they really wanted to put together an older age statement, something special, something showcasing, the incredible quality of Overeem whiskey even over time. And I think Ollie probably knows a little bit more about this bottling release than I do, but it's really cool brand.
So how familiar are people in the room with Overeem, like especially the garage door sort of setup that Casey had back in the day? Somewhat? No? Okay. I'll give the quick version, because I don't know what time people want to wrap up here, but we're only 2 whiskeys in, and we're 30 minutes in already. 2014, I was in a hiking trip to Hobart. I only really drank Scotch. I've never had an Aussie whiskey before, thereabouts. Turned up and they said, whiskey tours, jumped on this little micro bus, and they said, you visit 2 or 3 distilleries and finish on this Lark cellar door, which is by the water there, a little pub, not nowhere near the Lark Distillery. So I'm like, sure, whatever, this is 11 a.m. or something. You jump on and you go straight into the suburbs. And I'm like, what the hell is this? There's, houses and people walking dogs and prams and whatnot. Pull up in this cul-de-sac. It was just me and one other person. It was like a Tuesday afternoon or mid-morning, sorry. Yeah. And then, just this tour guide walked us up and he goes, I just knock on the garage door and I'll see you back in about an hour. And then he went off on his bus and we're like, okay, this is incredibly random. The tiny little garage door opens up and there's 2 giant copper stills in there, and there's like no room to kind of move around, but it's the smell, the aroma that just like came out. And Casey was in the middle of doing his distillate run. He had his apprentice Rob at the time there as well, basically learning under him, and he was filling, I think, Cask, I need to double check, but mid 100s. So getting right into it and working very hard. We ended up skipping the tour I did it the next day, and I stayed there for about 4 hours, learning about Aussie whiskey distilling, and he just, been good mates with him since, and we've obviously done a few releases with him, but that's for another time. Their new distillery is way more better. It's automated. Next door is you got Spirit Thief is there as well, and White Label, which is kind of a contracting distilling business. So all designed by Casey. There's a bunch of other founders. They're separate businesses. But yeah, you can actually go in and make your own gin, vodka, whiskey to spec, and then they can barrel it and mature it on site, or you can take it to your own bond store. And if you're ever interested, it's a great way to actually get started into distilling without the overheads. What I did wanted to say is at that site is a bond store that is kind of like a bunker underground. So if you ever go to the Overeem distillery and you get to do the tour and then go into the bond store, it's the original bond store for Lark and Overeem as well. So yeah, Bill didn't have the infrastructure. So you can see the two of them, Bill and Casey, very much shared a lot of knowledge that I was saying before, and shared infrastructure and resources. Tried to make very different whiskey at the time. But yeah, that it's such a great site and such a great tour. But that's my beginnings of Aussie whiskey and Overeem. So for me, their port cask strength's always been one of my favorites. This 12-year-old is barrel number 56 OHD, which is Old Hobart Distillery, which is Casey's garage. Overeem Distillery OD is the new designation for the new site, and then you also have Salford Casks will have an S in there or something, Salford Distilling SD or something. So if you ever work out why there's an Overeem with weird numbers, similar to Sullivan's Cove, where the famous one that won the global award back in 2014 was an HH bottling. So that's why some distilleries use different designations over time. That's all that matters. But yeah, this is barrel 56 that he put down. 12 would have been 13 years ago, back in his 200-liter big bourbon cask. I believe it was Heaven Hill. I need to double check that. So let me I'm actually curious myself. But yeah, big 60%er. I was lucky to actually try this. They released 2 at first, then they're going to release 2 more, and then they've got a couple more. But yeah, Casey's always had a dream to do a bourbon cask. He's kind of known for his port and sherry casks, but for him, he's like the bourbon. You can't hide. Like if you have average spirit, it will showcase in that. But if you have amazing spirit, it's gonna shine in a bourbon cask. So for him, yeah, he was awesome to get the cask back under the family name. And then when they did, they could have released it immediately, and he tried it. And I remember Jane and Mark saying that, you know what, they're going to do it as a 12-year-old. So they've been sitting on this for an extra 2 and a bit years, waiting to release it. But they wanted to hit that the dozen mark, because it's whiskey's ready when it's ready. And they tried it every 6 months, and another summer. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it. It's one of my favorite whiskeys.
It's super cool. And I obviously, I think Tasmania is a very, close-knit group, but to have those family distilleries, and it really is like family, and to the point where even Casey came out of his retirement to help Jane and Mark with whiskey and with the distilling, and now he's their brand ambassador, which is a lovely little turn on his head. But yeah, I think it's so cool to see these smaller distilleries with incredible reputations, really coming back and putting out stuff that is still new and still exciting. So yeah,
I agree with you, Leo. 48%. That's how it drinks. It's very easy.
I will say, I think we tried the 60% versus the 46%er, I think is the two of them. And we tried them next to each other, and I was like, I like the 60% because I can add a few drops. It brings it down to like a 50, and that's where I like it. And I think that's what I like about, bottling it at 2 different strengths and just showing like how ABV really makes a difference in flavor profiles, and they both taste great. I can't remember if this was my favorite, if the lower ABV one was my favorite. We'd had quite a lot of whiskey at that point, so Yeah. I know.
Thumbs up or thumbs
Thumbs
down?
up. Yep. What are we thinking? Yep.
Dan's unsure. All right. Well, look, it's not for everyone. We get it. That's the beauty of whiskey.
Mm.
Any questions on Overeem, or shall we kick on to what are your next Hellyers?
Mhm.
We can ask any time.
I just have one question. How are you pronouncing that Salford? Is that, how am I spelling that, Ollie?
I'll type it in.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
There you
Okay,
go.
thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good to see you.
Yeah. So super great distillery. They because obviously they kind of went with the theme of keeping it in the surnames, and they obviously couldn't use Overeem anymore, so they went with Jane's married name, Salford. So yeah, they were going to sneakily call it like S&O single malt, so they weren't saying Overeem, but they were implying that it was Overeem. So yeah, that was quite cute. So on to the Helios Road.
Fun fact. I want to see if anyone knows or is going to guess it. Helios Road and Sullivan's Cove have something in common that not everyone knows about from the early days. So you can try this whiskey and then let me know, or put in the comments any guesses.
So yeah, Helios Road is another pretty well-known distillery. Jacobs beat everyone to it.
Farmers, yes, they all farm.
Yeah. So yeah, Helios Road, based in Burnie, just outside of Launceston. I want to say it's a lovely little town, but it's just a little town. I mean, there's, apart from, heading up to the distillery, there's not a lot of sightseeing in the area. It is lovely, but it's definitely worth visiting Helios Road. When they started it in 1999, it was literally a bunch of dairy farmers from Better Milk. These are the same guys who did the ads that said Legend Dairy. So they were like, oh, well, we've noticed that distilling is taking off down in Hobart. We want to jump on board this bandwagon. We have a butt ton of money from milk, from dairy farming. And yeah, so they decided to open up a distillery right next door in their old, as Leah was saying, in their old cheese factory site. So they set it up, and there were a few production hurdles, is probably the best way to say it. And the way that they were making whiskey to start off with was not necessarily the best way to start making whiskey. And yes, as Jacob alluded to, dairy farmers love stainless steel and distillers love copper. So they definitely had to make some adjustments to their still in the early days. Actually, the still at Helios Road is still predominantly got quite a bit of stainless steel in it, but it's got like a copper head, copper line arm, all the things you really need to make sure the whiskey tastes like whiskey, or the spirit tastes like spirit when it comes off the still. And if you've ever gotten the chance, if you do ever get the chance to see behind the curtain and see, really the production site of where they make their spirit, you can tell it was built by dairy farmers. Literally everything is wrapped in like stainless steel, making sure it's all protected and all, clean and sanitary. And it's one of the most bizarre distilling setups I've ever seen, but in a really good way. And so they have this ginormous room that they use for distilling. They had huge stills, they had huge casks at their disposal because they had huge financial backing. And so they were able to produce really large quantities of this beautifully light appley spirit and fill a lot of casks early on, which is not something a lot of small craft distillers can do. So they're actually probably one of the few Australian distilleries that have a massive amount of aged stock on hand. Tragically, we don't see a lot of that. This is part of a series that they were doing for their anniversary of Helios Road. The previous bottling was a 2002 distillation bottling release. But a lot of their higher age statement single casks go straight to the European market. And they have done for the last quite a few years, which is why we've seen kind of Helios Road drop off the radar a little bit in terms of whiskey that isn't just the core original 12 heated, all that. So recently they've kind of changed tack a bit, and they're like, okay, Australians like whiskey too. We should, probably reach out and, see what Australia is wanting from the distillery, and how we can get back in touch with Australian consumers. And they're really reintroducing themselves to Australian whiskey lovers. They recently did a whole branding redo, including this very interesting advertising video that has the most Johnny Depp lookalike actor you've ever seen in your life, essentially wandering through the Tasmanian wilderness and landscape. And it's very beautiful. But yeah, so Helios Road's obviously had a little bit of a interesting relationship, I'd probably say, with the Australian whiskey market, because most of their stuff just went overseas. But we're starting to see a lot more of the older age statement stuff. They do predominantly mature in ex-bourbon as casks as well. But yeah, it's interesting to kind of see, because I feel like Helios Road is one of those distilleries where people are like, yeah, I know it. And now I'm, starting to get a little bit reacquainted with it. So interesting to see what you guys think of this. Obviously, you don't see too much old Helios Road. And the age can really make a difference with whiskies sometimes, especially Australian.
So recently I caught up with their new managing director, CEO. They're in 26 countries, like Starwood's in a dozen. Like they are Australian whiskey on the map. So when we say like, yes, we're Lark's starting to do a little bit as that. Lime Burners is doing a lot of export into specific markets, but yeah, 26 countries, and they've been doing it for a long time. They like to position themselves as like an entry-level whiskey around that $100 mark, which is incredibly competitive. There's a lot of new entries. Obviously, Ned has just come out saying they're taking on the Starwoods of the world as well, with a $60 sort of expression. So to kind of there's a lot of premium craft distilleries at that top, at the Sullivan's Cove. There's a lot in the middle. And then there's this race at the bottom for this entry level, or not the bottom, but the entry level on whiskey. So your $60 to $100 range of whiskeys. And whilst there's fierce competition in Australia, Hellyers dominates globally, and that they've always had their strategy. Their previous master distiller, 17 years at the distillery, Mark Little, he's now taken on an industry whiskey sort of job in Tassie, my understanding is. And yeah, the new boss of Hellyers is ex-Brown-Forman head of sales. He did worked at Coca-Cola as well. I think Ione, you announced his position, so you might actually know more about him than I do, what I remember. But I had a great chat with him. He's only been in the role.
What's his name?
Adam Bower. What's his name? Andy Bower. Sorry.
Oh yeah. He's the general manager there now, isn't he?
Yeah, and for him, he's come from this background of fast-moving consumer goods, and he wants to change the distillery around. And a big focus is they're rebranding their product, which you didn't hear from me, but they're announcing later this year. Major upgrades in automation. They have a female distilling team, because girls have better palates than guys. That's just a fact. We can't argue with that. It's we can go into it another time, but when you factor in some of these other distilleries in Tassie, like Heather, top of the game at Sullivan's Cove, they're taking note what's working. They're listening to consumers' feedback. So, look, Helios Road isn't for everyone, but watch the space is what I'm trying to say. There's a lot of changes happening there, and I think the next 3, 4, 5 years, even in the next 12 months, we'll start to see a lot of change. Obviously, they're aimed more predominantly at the entry level whiskey consumers, but it's such a competitive market. And, that's the bread and butter for most distilleries. We are buying expensive bottles, but, a distillery can't sell 400 bottles every month. They got to sell thousands, especially if they employ a dozen plus people. So we're very privileged and special to be in our position to drinking $500 plus whiskeys tonight. But yeah, it's great to see that Helios Road is taking on that feedback and thinking about how do we reposition ourselves in the local market here as well. And I look forward to see what comes out of it.
Absolutely. And I do love Leah's right, CJ. They do make a cream liqueur to rival Bailey's. So they actually sold the dairy company when it was taken over by a different foods company. They sold the dairy company and then they had to buy it back because demand for the cream liqueur was so high that they were like, oh crap, we need to get the cream in just to make the liqueur. It became too expensive to just buy it in. So they had to buy the dairy side of the company back. But yeah, I would say their cream liqueur is probably one of their biggest sellers. Obviously, it's not a whiskey, but if you've ever gotten the chance to try it, there is a reason why it is pretty much the #1 seller at all of our shows. It's insanely easy to drink. I think every whiskey show we have, I tell the guys, I'm like, bring more cases than you brought last time. Don't underbring it, because people want it, and it's really cool. And if you do go to the distillery, there are certain flavors that you can get only at the distillery of the cream liqueur. So they do a coffee flavor and hazelnut flavor. I think there's another one that I can't remember right now, but yeah, it's a bit of fun, and definitely a local alternative to Bailey's.
the best-selling Aussie Baileys out there.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Yeah.
Decisive feedback. Thumbs up, or hands, or a bit down. All right.
Wobbles, but
Look, are you happy you've tried it now? Because it's an 18-year-old Tasmanian whiskey, and it's it's up there. And we saw it, and we're like, there's a lot of whiskeys we could have put up, and I'm like, does it pack up the same punch as some of these others? That's a big question, and a little question we're going to continue to ask throughout the tasting tonight is, do they all, are they all at the same level, or is it simply because it's an age statement, and they can sort of claim that trophy? You're the consumers, you make the call at the end of the day. So, Michael, you don't have to buy it now, mate. Well, that's the joy of these virtual tastings.
And I agree with Tom. It's great that all the whiskeys have been very different, and everything we've tried so far has been ex-bourbon cask, pretty much. So, Howard, they should have kept the dairy and sold the distillery. Harsh. But no, I will say some of the single cask stuff. I was at Helios Road yonks ago now, and they were doing a hand fill your own cask. And so I've got a hand fill bottle of Helios Road, literally straight out of the barrel, that I hand filled back when they allowed that, and then they stopped doing that because I think they realized it was against RSA and all that. But yeah, some of the single casks that have come through that are in that kind of 10-year-old age range are pretty cool as well, and maybe we'll see some more of them coming up. But they're definitely working towards altering their core offering and giving it a little bit more oomph in life. So, this is old style Helios Road. Who knows what the future may bring with them? But yeah, I think we should perhaps skedaddle on to the next whiskey, the Killara. So also, Michael, I totally agree with you. The 15-year-old peated masters is really good, really good. But yeah, so onto the Killara Dark Mofo release. So for anyone who is unfamiliar with Christy Booth Lark, there is a rock that you've been living under. So obviously Bill Lark is the godfather of Australian whiskey. and Christy is his daughter. So she is actually the first second-generation distiller in Australian history, well, modern Australian spirits history. And she started her distillery back in 2016. So Christy grew up with the Lark, the first ever Lark still just outside her bedroom door. So literally grew up in the whiskey industry. And she named her distillery after the street that it was based on, that her childhood home was based in. Obviously she helped her dad out at Lark for a little bit. She did take on some distilling work with them, but she left in 2013 to become an air traffic controller. She really wanted to do that with her life. And so she went to school for air traffic control. And then she decided she was not into that, and she really, really missed distilling. She missed that connection to the spirit. And so, yeah, around came Killara. And with Killara, so not only was she the first second generation distiller, but it was the first solely female owned and operated distillery in Australia. And she's also really pushed women in the Australian spirits industry by setting up the Australian Women in Distilling Association. And she is an absolutely incredible woman who has so much to give to the industry and is absolutely insanely lovely if you get the chance to meet her. But yeah, so she started Killara in what was essentially a meat locker. So her original site for the distillery, it was an old industrial space. It was like multi-purpose. So there were different rooms for different businesses and stuff like that. And the original room was essentially an old cool room. And it was just this kind of, not that small, but definitely very Freddy Krueger horror movie kind of vibes if the lights weren't on. But she's since moved to a new site, which is a little bit more visually appealing, shall we say. But yeah, so she moved to a new site in 2019, having outgrown the previous space and needing somewhere to really host people to showcase her whiskey. So the best and coolest thing I think about Killara whiskey is that it's made on the most unusual still you've ever seen. And I think Norman and Tate were saying that they'd been to the original site and her original still. So it's a very ugly, dumpy looking still. It is quite portly with a really short line arm. And the idea was that she wanted to make a really meaty, heavy, malty spirit off of it. So for her, it wasn't about these like light floral styles, you know, she really wanted a whiskey with body to it. And it was also kind of a little bit modeled after the Lark still, but she worked with the still maker who helped make her father's still. So I haven't seen her new still, but I do know that it is still very much in that style of wanting to create a rich spirit. So this bottling was obviously done for Dark Mofo, the festival in Tasmania. If you don't know it, again, rocks living under, but it is one of the most incredible festivals of art, music, culture, and it really does define what, yeah, still a little dumpy still, so cute and portly. But yeah, so Dark Mofo Festival really kind of, I think, sums up the ethos of the Tasmanian people. And so this was matured in X20 cask for 4 years and then finished in a rum cask for 4 weeks. So yeah, I think we're seeing more and more rum cask coming around in Australian whiskey because firstly, there's a lot of rum produced in Australia, but also, as you guys can probably taste, it's awesome. It's a really, really great, great spirit cask to mature in. But yeah, cold chocolate and orange, absolutely Jaffa vibes. And yes, Christy also makes a fabulous gin called Apothecary. And the idea was to kind of keep them separate, the Killara whiskey and the Apothecary gin. And she's won some awards for it, I believe, as well. It's pretty spectacular.
We did a joint bottling where we did our Whiskey Lovers Australia bourbon cask with her, and then she put her gin in the bourbon cask, and then we did the gin bottling as a side if anyone got onto it. Very good, tasty gin. And then after we sold out the cask, Christy decided to submit that barrel with a bunch of others, and half a dozen of her whiskies out of 30 submissions, all won, including our one as well. Best whiskey in the world for its particular age or ABV or whatever category. So the fact that she can just submit awards and not just win one, like she comes back with multiple medals and all that sort of stuff. But I always say that Christy is probably, she's had the best apprenticeship in terms of the whiskey world in Australian history, at least, and two, she's probably the most experienced across all facets of the business, because outside of learning how to distill, her mum, Lynn, likes to make fragrances and perfumes, so she's a distiller by that side of the business. So the two of them share an interest of botanicals and understanding the ingredients. So Christie's had this sort of like world-round approach. It's not just how do you make a good whiskey the Lark way. She's had multiple exposure on all facets of the business. She was the managing director of Lark for a few years as well, before they got acquired and turned into a public listed company. So for her, she's traveled the world and done talks. Recently she led a contingent of part of the Australian Distillers Association. A group of 12 distillers went to Scotland, Ireland, toured all the big guys, Glendronach, Bushmills, and shared knowledge as well. So not just a humble little distillery. And it's probably 20-minute drive. Like everything Tassie's short. If you're from Sydney, Melbourne, and we're stuck in traffic, there's no traffic, first of all, and two, you get off the airport and go north 20 minutes and you're at Killara now. So a beautiful little place, and there's a little country town, a very historic town. I've had a complete mind blank. I will remember soon, but they make amazing pies and sponge cakes and all that sort of fun stuff. So make a day trip out of it.
I've heard such incredible things about the new site as well for Killara, so it's definitely worth a visit. And it really kind of
Richmond,
showcases. It kind of showcases how how a lot of Scottish distilleries kind of got their groove, that generational thing being passed down from one to the other. And you could probably say that Christy was responsible for a lot of Lark's most incredible and award-winning whiskies as well. So
Christy's dream is you go to Killara Distillery and it's kind of like, it's an experience. Don't just come for the copper porn. Like that's a wonderful part of visiting a distillery, this giant copper still, but you can wander through the gardens and all the botanicals that she works with will be there. There'll be barley growing in the back paddock, and it's a whole paddock to farm experience, and there'll be food served with local botanicals and herbs and all that sort of stuff as well. So very much like you can pick a tree and go smell the lemon myrtle or the wattle seed or whatever it is, and then go into it and then see it being made and then taste the end product. And that for her is her dream experience of what she's curating and putting together down there. So definitely worth visiting.
All right, shall we move on to the Lark then? So the OG distillery, I suppose, the one that started it all. Lark was Tasmania's first distillery in over 150 years. And it kind of all got started because Bill Lark was said to have an epiphany while he was out fishing near a peat bog, and was like, I love whiskey. We have so much incredible, water and barley and peat here in Tasmania. Why don't we make whiskey here? He soon learned the legislation and all that sort of stuff. So after a few years of lobbying with the help of an equally whiskey obsessed senator, he helped to have the distilling laws changed. So previously, you could only distill it if it was a still to the size of 2,700 liters or bigger, which is huge. I think at our Backwoods event, I think Lee was saying that his still is like, his little gin still's 500 liters and the slightly larger one was 1,200 or something like that. And so the restriction on the capacity of the still really just killed off any small craft distilling. The only people who could really afford it were giant companies with sugarcane money, aka Beanley and Bundaberg. So they changed the distilling laws, they had them amended. And there's this great story about when Bill Lark received his distilling license. In 1992, 2 ATO officers came out to see the first spirit come off the still because they were like, we've never seen this before. Like, it's not a thing that's ever happened in our career. And so, you know, obviously they had to be there for tax purposes or something like that. But yeah, these 2 ATO officers were just like watching excitedly as the spirit came off the still. And he paved the way for hundreds of other craft distillers. This insane boom that we have in the Australian spirits industry, which has gotten a recent light again thanks to the ATO and excise taxes. But this boom wouldn't have been possible without Bill and Lynn Lark. You know, Bill may be the godfather of Australian whiskey, but Lynn is really the godmother of Australian gin and that side of the spirits industry. So when Bill set out, they wanted to be very traditionally Scottish. They made their own wash. They, you know, wanted to make it as you know, small and craft as possible while making it quality, keeping it in the family. Obviously, Christy came on board and was quickly cellar door manager at the age of 17 and became managing director. And I'm sure RSA is different in Tasmania, but you know, so it was, you know, obviously a very inspirational space for both Christy and her brother Jack. And Jack has also started his own distillery as well, Battery Point. But yeah, so company grew, whiskey distillery grew, and they took on investors in order to keep growing the company. And eventually in 2013, Bill decided to sell the company to the investor group. Christy left, but Bill stayed on the board. But nowadays, like I was saying before, with Australian Whiskey Holdings having some fun times, Bill Lark is now no longer really a part of the company, not in a business sense anyway. But he actually spends a lot of his time in a semi-retired state of actually doing a lot of work when he's actually supposed to be retired. And he helps out other smaller distilleries all over the country. So pretty much nearly any whiskey distillery that's, you know, been set up in the last probably 5 to 10 years has had a visit from Bill Lark, and, you know, gotten, you know, a little bit of love from Bill Lark. So yeah, he's got many fingers and many pies, and he was the first Australian to be inducted into the Scottish Whisky Hall of Fame, which was very exciting. He's had a very long friendship with a lot of Scottish distilleries. I believe he was named Keeper of the Quake as well, which is quite an honour. So this bottling that we are drinking, the Lark Para 1992, is a little bit of a misnomer, I suppose you could say. 1992 refers to how old the tawny barrel is. So it's a Seppeltsfield X tawny barrel from 1992 that was used to finish this whiskey. And tragically, there's not too much 1992 spirit Lark kicking around, and I'm sure what there is probably in Bill's hands or Christie's hands. But yeah, this is kind of wanting to evoke that early style of whiskey making that Bill was doing. He was using a lot of fortified wine barrels from local wineries and stuff. So,
On your point of not much Lark Spirit, has anyone had like the first release Lark bottles, the tall fin with the blue? No.
the stripes.
And then they went to the fat ones that sort of almost mimicked an Overeem for a while, and then they went to their current look and feel. What else was I going to say? Old Sullivan's Cove, stainless steel, as we mentioned. I personally can't drink it. The current Helios Road tastes better than old Sullivan's Cove, like the very first ones. Like it's there's better whiskey. I'm just going to leave it at that. Old Lark, I think it was like better than stuff you could find in your local bottle-o, but it's not the quality of whiskey that Tasmanian whiskies today, because Bill was just like doing it in his living room, basically. Like they read a textbook, he bought whiskies from the bottle shop, and then he drank and he's like, okay. And then you have to wait 2 years. And yes, you can kind of try it on the way, and then you bottle it and you get consumer feedback and you did it again. So when you think an old Lark, like Lark's been around celebrating 30 years today. The first 15 years when it was basically him and a couple others, they didn't have that feedback loop that I was saying before. And you got to wait 2-3 years to kind of get a nice, 100-liter cask turnaround and get that feedback. There's a lot of time it takes to then take your improvements and improve on it. So Bill and Casey and Patrick and even the Hellyers guys, they did a lot of the heavy lifting, when now we get a lot more feedback and they've shared that knowledge. So maybe for sentimental value, but drinking value, some of the oldest Tassie whiskey and oldest Australian whiskey is just, don't expect it to be quality because of age, is what I'm trying to say, because they were learning and they had no way of like learning apart from just doing and getting feedback that 3, 4, 5 years later. So if you know modern day Lark, there's lots of whiskies. I chose this one because it's celebrating 30 years, and this is the 30-year anniversary, and they've just had Tassie Whiskey Week, and I just picked it because it was and it's in that top shelf category. It's quite an expensive whiskey, not everyone would buy. I'm reading the comments now, and it looks like that Tawny influence has come through a little bit too much, which is fine. I tried it just before to work out the order, and for me, it's just all dessert. It's all sugar. So that's the fun of whiskey, just because it's in that category. But sometimes these are the special releases. Old school, cask strength Lark bourbon cask, for me, like back in Christie's days, and then even some of the earlier Australian whiskey holding days, is some of the best spirit I think ever produced. I bought up as much as I can at the time because I knew it would run out soon. So if you ever get a hands of that, Heartwood have released a bunch of them over the years, as has what's the other IB down there, the Melbourne lawyer guy?
Spirit Thief?
Not Spirit Thief. The other one, I had a complete mind blank again. Dark Valley, thank you.
Melbourne lawyer guy, Alex Moores.
Thank you. I'm like, terrible, but I knew it'd come back. But yeah, their versions of Lark is what Lark used to be like, which for me is like what I fell in love with drinking Lark. So obviously the business has grown, publicly listed company, and it's changed a lot. But this is a special release. It's not going to be what I want to highlight. They do lots of special releases, but go back to their core range and try their cask strength bourbon cask and see how that compares. This is just a special whiskey we decided to crack tonight because I personally am not going to jump on every single special release. So I figured why not share with you guys as friends and get the feedback.
Yeah, it is pretty cool. I was lucky enough to get my hands on one of the metal circle label Larks, but I could only get it in a mini. But it's interesting to see as well how it's changed. And again, celebrating 30 years of Australian whiskey. And, you think about it, you're like, man, 30 years is a long time. I mean, I don't mean to age myself and everyone in the Zoom, but that was literally before I was born. But it's it's so relatively small in terms of whiskey around the world. You know, I've had people be like, well, Japanese whiskey is relatively new. I'm like, they've been at it for 100 years. So, you know, I think it's an industry that's only going to get bigger and better over time. And, you know, we can look back now on early iterations of Tasmanian whiskey, of Australian whiskey from every single distillery, and be like, this is, you know, completely different to how it is now, but you see that progression, and, you know, really inspires hope for the future of the industry and how it's evolving. And it's really cool. So in saying that, maybe we crack into the last whiskey, the Heartwood. So Tim Duckett was a environmental consultant. That was his job. I think he still might do it occasionally. And he actually met Lynn Lark while he was on a panel around a ski resort, something or other. And he met Lynn, and they got along. And when he realized they were making whiskey, they became even better friends, as Tim is an absolute whiskey fanatic. He had a huge passion for whiskey even before he, you know, started doing what he does now. So Heartwood is probably the most famous independent bottling company coming out of Tasmania, and probably in Australia, I would say. So he founded it in 2012 after quite a few years of collecting casks from all over Tasmania. So he had been buying up these barrels from Lark, from Sullivan's Cove, from all over, before he even knew what he wanted to do with them. So 2012, he decided he wanted to bottle some and sell them. And it was his own taste in whiskey that really defined the style of whiskey that we know Heartwood bottles today. And that is big, bold, and high ABV. I've met him a couple of times, and the name he gives to his favorite style of whiskey is a Brontosaurus whiskey. So big in the middle, just huge in the middle, with a really long finish. So Brontosaurus whiskeys are what Tim Duckett likes to bottle. And most of them end up bottled at natural cask strength, so you rarely find one below 50% ABV. He does also do a bit of work with Tasmanian independent bottlers, which is another kind of sub-label. And there he'll do blends, vatting. He's actually done a couple of blends that are two different Australian distilleries from totally opposite parts blended together. But Heartwood is predominantly single distillery or mystery whiskey. So he takes a lot of creative liberty with the name of each of the whiskies, either relating to something very Tasmanian, as with his release called We Are Cousins, which is my favorite name for a whiskey bottling ever. Or otherwise they tend to be related to the distillery that the whiskey comes from. So in this case, this is actually single malt whiskey from Nantes Distillery, which probably inspired the name of Fed by the Fuels of Malcontent and Disillusionment, most likely. But yeah, so this is a sherry and potentially a little bit of port single cask of Nantes whiskey in this. So he does try to put as much information on the bottlings as he can. Obviously, with Nantes Distillery, it's a little bit of a mystery sometimes. After kind of the, I suppose, scandal, shall we say, with Nantes Distillery, a lot of the information of what whiskey was in what casks and what was what really had to be figured out. So it was actually the CEO of Australian Whiskey Holdings at the time, and Tim Duckett, who sat down and they tasted through all of the barrels, not at once, but all of the barrels that they could that had whiskey in them, in order to try and work out what casking they were, whether it was, they didn't do peated, thankfully, so there wasn't too much confusion there. But going through essentially the net compendium, the index of whiskey that they did have that was still in a barrel, Tim was able to pick out a couple of barrels, and he's doing some of them as his current releases. He's branched out into other things. Brandy, he did a barrel-aged gin, which was quite excellent.
More's coming this year. 2 more, I think.
Nice. But yeah, so he is headfirst into the industry, really experimenting, but also just getting really, really cool casks. So having been friends with the likes for many years and getting to know different distillers and different brands, he really has some incredible connections and can get some really insanely cool casks. He obviously inspired his son, Louis Duckett, who is one of the co-founders of Battery Point with Jack Lark. So the Ducketts and the Larks have been friends for a very long time. And Louis is now also very into whiskey. But yeah, it's the biggest, oldest, probably most flavoursome whiskey on the event tonight. But you couldn't really go through the history of Australian whiskey without including the Heartwood. So, yeah.
Before we jump in the whiskey, a couple of things I love about Tim. Don't ever make the mistake that I do and call up and go, hey, can I pop in to visit the distillery? Because he will hang up on you and go, I'm a bond store. I only have a bond store. I'm not a distillery. So don't make that mistake like I did. But very humble guy, very welcoming. If you ever get a chance to pop in, it's an amazing experience. He predominantly, where possible, prefers to buy new make and then control the entire experience of the whiskey and the maturation, especially on his terms in his bond store, versus most other independent bottlers where even us, like the Whiskey List, will go to a distillery and go, can we buy a cask that was as a bottling? And they go, we've got 3 available, and then we try them and we pick our favorite and then we choose our ABV and bottle it. Tim does the very long road where he will go, I want the new make, and he will then bottle it, he will mature it, he will taste it, he will massage the casks, he will, in terms of someone who manages their barrel program, Tim will keep a very close eye on it. And if it's not ready, or if it's over oaked, because sometimes Tassie whiskey, 20 or 30 litre cask is ready at 18 months, and legally it's going to be 2 years of cold whiskey, he will then fix it by either putting it into another cask or blending it, or sometimes when the cask isn't ready, he will bring it from the back of his bond store to the garage door during the, and Tim's coined this term, whiskey matures in Australia by summers, not by years. So you now, a lot of distillers are starting to talk about it. We talk about it as well. Is when you have a 5-year-old whiskey, it doesn't matter, it's how many summers. Was it 5 summers or 4 summers? And that's a great way to kind of understand, because we have such extreme weathers here. It's that exposure of the whiskey in the wood. So if the whiskey's not mature enough and he knows the summer's coming up, he will bring them all to the front of his garage door and then sometimes even open them up for a couple of hours each day just to get that wood exposure going. So he is very hands-on in his treatment of, because he's not making the whiskey, he's buying the new make, and then he's in charge of the entire experience afterwards. To get are these his Nance Spirit that he bought new make or as casks? I'm not sure.
It's quite old, so I believe it might have been one he purchased. He might have purchased it recently though. So that's the thing, obviously. The sorting through of barrels from net took a very, very long time. And so it may be a recent purchase, but an older whiskey. I know that Chris Malcolm also picked up a couple of barrels for himself as well. I think Tim Duckett's probably one of the best people in Tasmania. I recall visiting Adams Distillery, and they were like, "Oh, we forgot you were coming." And out of the cooperage on site saunters Tim Duckett, and he's like, "Hey guys, what are you doing here?" And without even a heartbeat passing, "Come check out the cooperage." And he starts showing us around the cooperage from Transwood, which is a father and son cooperage duo on site at Adams Distillery. And he's just taking us around. And he's just like, "These guys are doing really cool stuff. Let's go out for drinks tonight." And it was like, "Oh my God, okay, cool." You just happened to be around, and he took us out for dinner. And he's just so supportive of the industry, of people who are interested and invested in the local Tasmanian industry. If someone could really be a spokesperson for Tassie whiskey, it would be Tim Duckett. He's just so passionate about it, and it's always so good to see people uplifting other distillers. And I'm sure he gets some pretty nice casks out of his friendships. But yeah, so it's definitely an icon, and someone to really thank for bringing independent bottling to Australian whiskey as well. So
Trying out a new poll tonight, tender multiple choice. So if you want to vote for all 6, go for it. I would recommend maybe only picking a top 3, just so we have a bit of diversity in the poll results. But we got
donkey votes.
interesting results so far.
Mhm.
Just before I release them, what are people's thoughts on the Heartwood? Thumbs up, thumbs down. It's 58.5%, and this is a banger of a Nance. Like, imagine if Nant, like, the whole story just continued, and then they didn't do the barrel investment program, and things worked out well, and they were producing whiskey of this caliber. Like, it would be. This is. Yeah. I asked him, what whiskey you got coming up and what's interesting, and he has a few other Tassies, and then I looked at that one, and he's like, it's Nance, don't know if you would be interested. I'm like, absolutely. I think we got to tell the story of it's a top shelf Tasmanian tasting tonight, and Nant, for better or worse, is part of the Tasmanian whiskey history and journey. We forgot to mention Pete Bignell of Belgrove with Remnant and his family, who bought some barrels back and releasing them with a fun Tassie children's character sort of esque labels, and fly by night. There's cows, there's tawny, frogmouths, and all kinds of cool stuff. Check them out if you haven't. Remnant Black Spot is good. Just reading some of the comments here. Heartwood, Sullivan's Cove, Norman, forget the rest. Fair enough. Age is unspecific for this one. For the Nance. Yep, agree, Michael.
Michael, I agree. I reckon it was pre-scandal spirit as well. I think it's probably edging up to that like 7-8-year-old kind of vibe. But yeah, it is, and I agree with Nick as well. It's supremely approachable. It drinks better than some of the other whiskeys, and it's higher ABV. But yeah, it's one of those things. I think what happened with Nant and the obviously the totally illegal business practices and schemes and scandals and all that. It's a dark stain on Australian whiskey history, but I think it's a mistake that was made so early in the history of the industry that I think the long-term lessons that came out of it are, something they'll stay for a really long time. And I think that's probably going to benefit the industry in the future, where you're going to have more savvy consumers, you're going to have more savvy distillers, and it is going to be something where it's like, we have to be our authentic selves in every sense of the business practice and every sense of making whiskey. So it's just sad to see that the whiskey was really good.
I love these results. I think experience has come through. The Killara, I think it's also the cheapest whiskey of the night. At
What's it
200 and
release?
yeah, it's $265 for a bottle. Whilst the Lark Para is 500. You know, for comparison, the Overeem bourbons are 550, 600. So you know, the Hellyers is of similar price point as well. The Sullivans Cove was around the $400 mark from thereabouts. So yeah, to have that as the favorite. I don't know if it's just the rum cast finish or something, but yeah, I agree with what Dan mentioned before, that the hype is real. So yeah, Christie, I personally think is one of the most experienced distillers in Australia. Maybe not legally when you start working from, but just because of her history and the exposure she's had and what she's done for the industry herself. Everyone talks about her parents, but yeah, Christie needs her time in the limelight, and I think it's definitely coming. It's just the beginnings of her new distillery, and yeah, awesome things to come. But quick question, are you guys enjoying these top shelf tastings? We grab some random bottles, things that you typically don't buy. I know it's only 20 mils and we try and do them at break even, so we do it as a bit of fun. But are you enjoying that we're theming it up? Sometimes it's a distillery vertical, sometimes it's a category or a region vertical. Is this something we should keep doing? Because I want to keep doing it, but only if you guys are interested.
Yes, I also want to keep doing it because it means, I get to taste cool whiskeys as well. It's definitely a bit biased from my perspective, but I think one thing I'm really curious to hear back from you guys, do you prefer the themed ones like Tassie, or do you prefer the distillery focused ones? Because I think that, obviously we've got Bunnahabhain coming up, but, having a fun theme and going through a lot more, there's a lot more to learn. So, all right, got a few people who are enjoying the themed. Okay.
From a media point of view, I love the theme thing because we hear about Tassie, we hear about it it's such piecemeal, the story. So it really is great from getting that overview of what is so special about it, understanding the community and all those origin stories. I've just loved hearing about them tonight. The other one I wanted to ask about was because Chris Malcolm went through those barrels, I think, with Tim Duckett, and now he's released some through Hidden Lake. Have you tried that yet?
I haven't tried any of those whiskies. I know it was a little bit because all those Nant barrels, after they were rifled through by Tim and Chris, went on to sale for other people to buy. That's how Peter got some of his. There was definitely some whisperings of the idea that maybe Chris kept a few really, really good ones for himself. So I would hesitate to guess that they're probably really good quality, because he got first dibs, first taste, first all that. But I haven't personally tried any myself.
I haven't tried any yet, but I'm loving this Heartwood that we just tried tonight.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Like I said, imagine if Nant continued, and we just skipped through all that BS that happened with it. But that's the fun. There's an industry in its infancy. We're at 30 years. Scotch and Irish have been around for hundreds of years. So where will Aussie be in the next 30 years? There's 300 distilleries, 350 or something. We're about to hit 100 Aussie whiskies in market this year. I was expecting it by Christmas last year. I prematurely guessed that number. I think we hit 88. So we're not close. We're in the 90s now. So there'll be Lord Byron and a few others are launching in the next couple of weeks. Apparently. So
Cape Byron, not Lord Byron. Byron?
Cape Byron. Yeah, Lord Byron, the
poet,
Gins.
I think.
It's awesome. These pockets of regions of whiskey is popping up all around Australia. So it's not just Tyron as well, Cape. Thank you everyone for your corrections. But it's been a pleasure. If you've got any other questions, hang on, we can jump on and talk. Otherwise, I guess we'll turn off the formalities for tonight. It went a little bit over time, but I think this was a special tasting. I think these ones we can play with and not rush through $500 whiskies.
Quickly say as well, I do have to, while it's still recording, say a big thank you to Luke McCarthy. If you guys don't have a copy or haven't seen his book, The Australian Spirits Guide, it is one of my go-tos. And he's got his website, Oz Whisky Reviews. And I love Australian whiskey, and I love talking about it, and I love learning about it. But Luke is really an expert. And I think there might be another book coming in the future from him, which I will keep nudging him about because we need an updated version. There's just so many more amazing distilleries out there. But yeah, obviously, learning about the history of Aussie whiskey is something we can all get behind. Sorry for interrupting, Ollie. I was like, I have to give him a little thank you.
Luke was meant to join us tonight, but he had a pre-arranged appointment. But he's said next time we do another Aussie themed whiskey top shelf, he's going to come and tell us his version of Aussie history, and he knows a million times more than us. So he's done a few virtuals with us in the past. So good mate of ours, and yeah, check out his website ozwhiskyreviews.com for any of the latest goss. Yeah, guy on the ground on the coalface.
Maybe that's what we should do. We should do like a Corayo tasting with him.
All right. If anyone wants to hang on, we can keep chatting Aussie whiskey. I'm just going to pause the recording.